Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, I have a new lavalier mic, so we're going to see how this turns out. Hopefully it's not too muffled. I've got it kind of buried into my shirt a little bit, but I suppose we'll find out. If this works well, then that means that I don't have to hold the mic anymore, which is super convenient because holding the mic used to make my arm cramp up. And also people would ask me, what is that, Greg? Is that a shaver? Except for one guy. One guy recognized that it was a tash cam. And apparently, it's very common for people to use stuff like that tash cam in recording. It's just that they don't hold the tash cams up to their face, they plug the tash cam into a lavalier mic and work with that. So that's what we're doing! But anyway, that little bit aside, what else is going on? It's the end of the year, so been looking at taxes and stuff like that, plans going forward with a website. We might do a bit of an update on stuff coming up, but I suppose there's not really too much to talk about there. What I did want to talk about today was a book series by Piers Anthony, or actually rather just all the bodies of work that he did as I remember them from my childhood. And the reason I wanted to do this is I was sitting around thinking to myself, like, what should I do with personal time on today? And, or rather, this week, I was thinking about this earlier. And I was looking at my bookshelf and I was like, well, I talked about Terry Pratchett once. And like Terry Pratchett I read a lot more of when I got into high school and into college. But when I was a kid, I used to read a book like every single week, like one book a week. That was kind of my rule. And I never deviated from that. And it was easy when you were reading things like Goosebumps. Like when I was young, I'd read like Goosebumps stuff. And I remember I used to get in trouble for reading during class. Like, in grade school it's funny because I guess that like a lot of, it's a common trouble to try and get like boys into reading. And so the teachers would be at this kind of, it was a problem because they'd be like, well, Greg seems to lose interest in class and he just starts to read his book. And that's a problem, but it's good that he's reading, so that's okay too. And I got into this sort of thing when I was in school. But as I got to be a little bit older, when I started to hit like my preteens and my teens, I started reading this author named Piers Anthony. And in retrospect, now that I think about it, his books are actually kind of smutty for a young boy. Piers Anthony he's an interesting author. Like, he's a good author, from what I recall. Like, his books are genuinely compelling. But the guy definitely writes a lot of his own fetishes into his books. And so the first one that I want to talk about is the Zank series. And Zank is funny because it takes place in Florida, more or less, but it's magical Florida. And there are all these maps, and like there's this pantheon of gods, and each of the gods kind of controls a different part of the universe. So there's like Jupiter, and the god Jupiter controls Jupiter, and the god Mars controls Mars, and you know, like they have all the gods for the planets, and you know, Earth controls Earth, which in Zank they call Mundania, and then there's Zank, the demon god Zank, and Zank controls Zank. And if you look on the map, it's just Florida. Like, the land of Florida is controlled by this god Zank. And anyway, for whatever reason, this god has taken over Florida, and he's decided that this is just going to be magical as all get out. So he takes his power in this little concentrated area, you know, compared to everybody else, and instead of like trying to expand his empire and having the biggest planet with like the least amount of stuff going on in it, he focuses on having like the smallest territory with the most amount of stuff. So everybody that's born gets a unique talent. Like, and it's not like, oh, you're good at carpentry or something like that. It's not like My Little Pony where you have the butt marks and they tell you like, you know, you're good at this one very job-oriented thing. It's like one person gets to talk to plants, or another person gets to transform into like tigers. Like, you're just born and you can just do that. You transform into a tiger. And so on. So everybody has this incredibly unique talent, and he would just make up all these different characters and they could do different things. Like, he had one character named Dorf, I think it was, and Dorf could speak to inanimate objects, and his girlfriend was named Ivy, and Ivy could control plants. I can't remember all the talents. There was one guy whose talent was to know everything, and he was kind of like the plot. Every single book, every single Zank book, people would go to this guy, and I can't even remember what his name is anymore. It was like something to something. And he had these puzzle towers. Like every single time you went to go see him, you had to solve these puzzles. And if you didn't solve them correctly, then I think that he would get mad and he would do something to you. But you had to go through his stupid puzzles and solve the puzzle. And then when you arrived at his tower, and you'd be like, hey, dude, I need an answer to a problem I'm having. Like, I need to learn how to lose weight. And then he would send you on like some kind of inane quest to go and lose weight. And you would go to like the far reaches of whatever, and you'd go to a tower and you'd find that there was a stone in that tower that would make you lose weight. But actually, what you would learn along the way was that you didn't need to lose weight. You were happy where you were at. I mean, it was a healthy weight. Like, if you went to see a doctor, he would say, like, well, you're fine, you're fine. And so you would learn that. You would learn that along the way, over your inane journey. And so they were kind of like, you could consider them like fables in a way, or like parables or something like that. Every single one of these books was kind of like a fable or parable, or I don't know, an Aesop or something like that. And so for a young person, they were kind of like good books to read. It wasn't too bad. It was all about kind of various characters discovering themselves and having their place in society sort of spelled out based on who they were and what they could do, and it was fun. But I come back to the fact that he was incredibly smutty of an author, which I don't know if this makes him worse for the job that he was doing or better. I think it probably makes him better, because if your parents didn't know, I mean, like, you think about television, and people get really on television, they're like, oh man, like, you just set your kids down in front of the TV and you have no idea what they're seeing. Like, it could be anything. You could turn away for 15 minutes, and those little guys on the TV, like, those My Little Ponies, they could just drown Pinky. Like, you would turn around for 15 seconds, drown Pinky. Boom, you turn around, Pinky's dead. You gotta explain to your kids, why did the ponies drown Pinky? Like, why did that happen? It's just terrible. It's just terrible. Man. Terrible. But books are actually much, much worse. If you have a child who, like, really likes to read, odds are really good that you as a parent are probably not actually reading the same books that your kids are reading, because they read at a level somewhat below you, and so most of their books are probably a little bit more dull than what you're used to, or they're not really the kind of genre that you read. And so there's no way you're going to sit here and flip through like a 200-page novel and find out that there's like a whole section dedicated to describing two characters banging each other. And this was something that Piers Anthony did on a regular basis. Almost every single one of his novels had a sex scene in it. And the guy was a huge fetishist for underwear. And so, like I talk about, there was magic, like everybody had their own special talent. Well, there was also dragons, and there were ogres, and griffins, and rocks. And by rocks, I mean the birds, because we're onto winged things. But not only were there magical creatures and like magical spells and magical people, but also women's underwear was magical. All women's underwear was always magical, all the time. I think it even had power if they took it off, but if a woman was wearing underwear, it had the power to stun or knock unconscious like any man who laid eyes on this undergarment. And so this was a thing that he never really fully explored the exact absurdity of. There were rules, and this was also kind of funny, and this is probably why this also fit really well as a novel for like a preteen to like early teen boy, was that there was like a rule. There was a set of rules established by the Parents' Committee or something like that. I can't remember what exactly it was called, but in Zank it was magically illegal for underage people to see lewd things. So if like a couple banged, or they called it summoning the stork, this was what was really weird. It was banging, but like people never got pregnant, and this was so that people could bang and then like continue on in their adventures and then like have kids, and you never had to bench the women. Like this was kind of interesting. It's like he would be like, yeah, they summoned the stork, and so 9 months later the stork comes with a baby, and throughout that entire 9 months, like we can continue our adventure and we can go far and wide and everything will be fine. So yeah, you summoned the stork, and it freed up the female characters to continue doing female character adventures. Because some of the books were focused entirely, like, he had reoccurring female characters that would show up, and there was no way that they could cram that much adventuring into a lifetime. Given the fact that some of them would have, 6 kids or something like that. Like, it was just unimaginable otherwise. So the stork summoning thing, it, made it happen. I was like, oh yeah, and I had another kid, and the stork delivered the kid, and I look after the kids, but, you can only summon the stork once every 9 months. You can't do it again. So just weird, he had this weirdness. And anyway, so there was a censorship law, and it was a magically enforced censorship law. Not in that you couldn't violate it, but that if you violated it, it sent out a magic signal that caused, this magical council of concerned parents to call you into a court case. And this court case could do, freaking anything. I recall there being, this very important creature, there was a surrogate mother to some sort of bird. Like I mentioned a rock. There was this rock that was guarding an egg, and this egg was I don't know, the universal egg of power, or something like that. Like a whole ton of magical power was being stored in this egg, and the child inside it was significant to the universe somehow. I don't remember what the exact plot was, but at some point, I don't know what the bird did, but the bird did something that the panel of parents, the panel of concerned parents, felt was inappropriate to do around the child. And so there was a whole book that was dedicated to like this court case, where they sat down and the adventure was they had to go out and try to come up with like, is it right or is it wrong for a bird to do something inappropriate in front of an egg? Like, does the egg have enough awareness to have been permanently scarred by what this bird did? And I believe that at the end, they ruled that yes, the bird should be held accountable for everything it did wrong. And what was weird is this wasn't like satire. This was sort of just a really bizarre facet of the Piers Anthony Zank universe. And part of that, I think, is why I like to read so many of the books, was that, for one thing, I was young. I was a young teen, and so you had a sex scene in every single book. So of course I would keep coming back to that at that age. And then the other thing was that you just had all these really bizarre rules going on. Like, characters could do things. So you'd have, like, characters that could destroy, you know, whole cities. Or you think about, like, the underwear thing. Like, underwear stuns a man. It doesn't just stun him, it, like, make him go blind. Like, women's underwear had all this phenomenal power in this setting. And so you ask yourself, like, well, why wouldn't you just show off your underwear to, like, defeat an oncoming army? I mean, assuming the army was mostly men, like, what would they do about it? And the answer is that, well, you can't, because the concerned League of Parents would show up and arrest your ass and then send you off on some really bizarre rule. I think that what they decided for this rock was that they decided that the rock would become the personal slave to the child for the rest of eternity or something like that. Because it was like, it wasn't even the bird's fault. Like, the bird was just being a bird. Like, it wasn't doing anything that really would have been... Like, the ruling made no sense. It was just like, well, it was a bird and it meant well. You know, it was trying to do bird things. Gosh, I wish I could remember what this bird did that was apparently so lewd that it required a whole book. It was something super dumb. And that's why the court case was like in a stalemate, because it was so dumb. That was actually kind of the point, is that the whole court case was super dumb. And there were a lot of people who wanted to dismiss the case because it was super dumb, and it was about a pair of birds. It's about a pair of stupid birds. And at the end, like I say, at the end, they were just like, yeah, the birds did break the law. The birds did break the censorship laws, so sorry, birds. Yeah. But just Florida. It was Florida. You would just like get in your car and you would drive south from, like, you know, the East Coast, and you would just get into Florida, and boom, you were surrounded by magic and everything else. But I think that in the setting you couldn't do that because there was like a barrier or something like that, and the only time you could slip through the barrier was during like really bad hurricanes or things like that. Like if a hurricane blew in, then it would weaken the magical barrier and people could kind of go into it. And most of the modern world had given up on trying to conquer Xanth because every time they went in there, like, stuff didn't work properly anymore. I remember Xanth also having like a lot of really bizarre, like Amelia Bedelia crap going on. One that I remember that stands out was the time that they found a cat ass trophy, and it was like magically enchanted so that if you messed with it, it caused some kind of catastrophe. See? So it was like a pun. But there was just so much of that crap in this guy's universe. Like everything was a weird pun or some kind of weird Amelia Bedelia, you know, like put dates in the bowl, and then they get like a calendar and they'd put like calendar dates into the bowl, and then the calendar dates would be edible for no reason because Amelia Bedelia, you know. So Zank, weird, just weird, weird setting. As far as I recall, he was a good author. He was interesting to read. But it's been so long, it's been like over a decade since I last read one of those books. So I couldn't tell you, I couldn't tell you again if they're any good. I mean, like if I were to go and read them now as an adult, I might be like, oh, I should not recommend this to people. But I recall them being interesting. He also did another series, I believe, in a setting called Phase. And Phase was kind of neat. This was another neat premise. Like I said, he just had always interesting and bizarre premises. But Phase was set up to where there was like a high fantasy world and then a high tech world, and they were mirror images of each other, sort of. Like for every person that existed in this high fantasy world, there was a person who existed in the high tech world. And you'd think this wouldn't be possible because population rates would be super high in the high tech world, but it was possible because to make the balance work, every time the people in the high-tech world advanced a little bit, it created more pollution and made it that much harder to sustain life, in spite of the leaps forward that they'd made in technology. And of course, on the high fantasy side, you had like all kinds of magic, like, you know, medical magic that could keep people alive for longer, and so on and so forth. So if a guy died in Phase, then he would also die in the high tech world, which I can't remember what they called that. But the high fantasy thing made a certain amount of sense. It was kind of like, you know, you had wizards and you had you know, serfs and this and that, and all the story kind of revolved around the nobility, because all the common people were kind of like stupid. They were like peasants. You know, you can't write high fantasy and do stuff with the peasants. The peasants have to till the fields. So like all the nobility and stuff were running around. They were all these political guys, and they were movers and shakers, and they kept getting into these political spats. And so they had like every kingdom was divided up into colors. So there was like the purple kingdom and the blue kingdom, and the yellow kingdom and the tan kingdom, and they wound up. This one made a lot more sense for sex to be involved, because by marrying and intermingling and stuff like that, like they found that, like, for example, the Tan Empire didn't like the Blue Empire, but one of the daughters to the Tan King was really fond of one of the sons of the Blue King, and so like the son of the Blue Prince would have sex with the Tan Princess, and then they would kind of make peace, and they'd be like, well, if we're banging now on an official level, I guess we're allies now. But what happens in this book series is that the upper class, you know, these nobles, figure out how to switch places with their high-tech counterparts. And the whole book series then kind of winds up focusing on everything getting out of whack, where people are able to start sending messages back and forth between the two universes. And they're like, oh, if we screw something up, like in Phase, then this high-tech world, things will kind of balance out and go out of whack. So like, if I'm having trouble here, then I can kind of go over here, and I can do things, and I can take some of my knowledge. And so by screwing around, like, things didn't happen exactly accurately. Like, you might go south, and your counterpart would go north. But things would kind of balance out over the long run. It was sort of you could think of it as more like a chemical reaction, where you never really go all the way to one side of a chemical reaction or all the way to the other. You maintain sort of an equilibrium trending towards one particular side. This is not an easy metaphor unless you know chemistry, but if you know chemistry, this is how it worked. So anyway, yeah, the future world was equally about the same way, where you had your Tan Empire and your Blue Empire and everything else, but with one catch. Everyone in the high science setting had to be naked, except for the nobility. The nobility was allowed to wear clothes, and that's how you knew that they were nobles. They got to run around in blue clothes, or purple clothes, or tan clothes, depending on where you lived, but everyone else had to be naked at all times. And this allowed Piers Anthony to write a lot about naked people. Because I'm pretty sure the man was a massive horn dog. He didn't get to write nearly as much about women's underwear in this series, but definitely there was a lot of jiggling butts being described, as I recall, when it came to the high fantasy stuff. But again, it was a mix. There was like a certain amount of political intrigue. It was something that I think that, like, as far as I recall, like, I looked into it when I was a little bit younger, and it seemed like he was actually doing pretty decently as an author, and I believe it was because he was hitting on that demographic, like, where you think, like, oh man, how can I get like a 13-year-old boy to read books? Like, what do they want? Like, they want to skateboard and play video games. And then, like, here's Greg with his Piers Anthony books, and it's like, oh, well, Greg's really into it. Like, Greg, what a good boy Greg is, you know? Not like the other boys running around, like, you know, skateboarding and stuff like that. He's learning. He's reading. I was reading smut. It was smut. I mean, it was high fantasy smut, but that was, you know, it's like, that's one way to get that male teen audience to read. Just don't let the parents know. My parents never realized how absolutely smutty those books really were. I do believe I had a friend who read it in high school, and he commented to me. He did comment to me. He goes, yeah, Piers Anthony, he's like a really good author. Like, I like the way that he writes. But I mean, doesn't it seem like there's a lot of sex in these books? And like, I thought about it for just a second, and I was like, yeah, there's actually quite a lot of sex in those books. So yeah, Piers Anthony. I mean, maybe you've heard of him, maybe you've read him. I would say give him a shot, but I don't remember if he's actually any good. This is one of these things from my childhood. my adult childhood, my child adulthood. Yeah, but weird premise, but a good way to capture that very particular market. Yeah. After that, I mean, like, I think I read most of the books that this guy had written, in fact, or at the time. Like, I got to the end of the series that he had written, and then I started looking into other books, and actually, I quit reading a little bit after I got out of Piers Anthony, sadly. And this wasn't because of Piers, this wasn't because, like, I lost interest in books that didn't have smut in them. I went on to read some other books. But the trouble was, I was like, oh, like, I like the high fantasy elements of Piers Anthony, so I tried to go and read other high fantasy. And then I got into, like, God, just very dry. Like, there's a lot of fantasy books that are really, really badly written. You really can't just go to the library and, like, just grab a book and just be like, oh, dragons! Like, how could you screw up dragons? There are so many ways you can screw up dragons. Like, oh, man. So many ways. There's a couple books that were really fascinating that I got into, like a couple trilogies or things like that had some really interesting elements. But as far as I recall, when I finally quit reading, it was a little while after I'd gotten out of Piers Anthony, and I started trying to find other fantasy books to fill the hole. And I just got into one author who was obscenely boring. And I told myself, like, I used to have a rule that I would finish one book before I start the next. So, you know, it used to be like 1 week, book finished, start the next book. And so I would do this. Like, I went through, like I say, every single week, which is how I say, like, well, I read all the Piers Anthony series. Well, of course I did. I was reading a book every single week, and so Piers Anthony was, like, he had a whole series, and so I would just be like, oh, okay, what's the next one in the series? And I'd go to the library, and I would read that book. And I just kept going until I'd read them all. But I got to this book, and I was like, man, I hate this book. But I have to finish this one before I start on the next one. And I never finished that book. I've never finished it, I never will, I don't even know where it is anymore. I believe it's probably destroyed by now, because I used to have some books, and then my family moved those books down to the basement, and then there was water damage. So that's also how I lost a bunch of my old role-playing books. Yeah. But that's Piers Anthony. That may not be a fully accurate retelling or explanation of the kind of stuff that he did, but I was just thinking about it and reflecting on how, like, now that I'm older and I realize exactly what it was that I was reading, I can think of exactly why I read it, and it wasn't just the sex, it was other things, but kind of amusing in retrospect. So anyway, thanks for joining me, everybody. I will catch you all next time.